showing the manifest inconsistence of the Arminian notion of liberty of will, consisting in the will's self-determining power. Having taken notice of those things which may be necessary to be observed concerning the meaning of the principal terms and phrases made use of in controversies concerning human liberty, and particularly observed what liberty is according to the common language and general apprehension of mankind, and what it is as understood and maintained by Arminians, I proceed to consider the Arminian notion of the freedom of the will, and the supposed necessity of it in order to moral agency, or in order to anyone's being capable of virtue or vice, and properly the subject of command or counsel, praise or blame, promises or threatenings, rewards or punishments, or whether that which has been described as the thing meant by liberty in common speech be not sufficient, and the only liberty which make or can make anyone a moral agent, and so properly the subject of these things. In this part I shall consider whether any such thing be possible or conceivable as that freedom of will which Arminians insist on, and shall inquire whether any such sort of liberty be necessary to moral agency, etc., in the next part. And first of all I shall consider the notion of a self-determining power in the will, wherein, according to the Arminians, does most essentially consist the will's freedom, and shall particularly inquire whether it be not plainly absurd, and a manifest inconsistence, to suppose that the will itself determines all the free acts of the will. Here I shall not insist on the great impropriety of such ways of speaking as the will determining itself, because actions are to be ascribed to agents and not properly to the powers of agents, which improper way of speaking leads to many mistakes and much confusion, as Mr. Locke observes. But I shall suppose that the Arminians, when they speak of the will's determining itself, do by the will mean the soul willing. I shall take it for granted that when they speak of the will as the determiner, they mean the soul in the exercise of a power of willing or acting voluntarily. I shall suppose this to be their meaning, because nothing else can be meant without the grossest and plainest absurdity. In all cases, when we speak of the powers or principles of acting or doing such things, we mean that the agents which have these powers of acting do them in the exercise of those powers. So, where we say, valor fights courageously, we mean the man who is under the influence of valor fights courageously. Where we say love seeks the object loved, we mean the person loving seeks that object. When we say the understanding discerns, we mean the soul in the exercise of that faculty. So when it is said the will decides or determines, this meaning must be that the person in the exercise of power of willing and choosing, or the soul, acting voluntarily, determines. Therefore, if the will determines all its own free acts, the soul determines them in the exercise of a power of willing and choosing, or, which is the same thing, it determines them of choice. It determines its own acts by choosing its own acts. If the will determines the will, then choice orders and determines the choice, and acts of choice are subject to the decision and follow the conduct of other acts of choice. And therefore, if the will determines all its own free acts, then every free act of choice is determined by a preceding act of choice, choosing that act. And if that preceding act of the will be also a free act, then by these principles, in this act too the will is self-determined. That is, this, in like manner, is an act that the soul voluntarily chooses, or, which is the same thing, it is an act determined still by a preceding act of the will, choosing that. Which brings us directly to a contradiction, for it supposes an act of the will preceding the first act in the whole train, directing and determining the rest, or a free act of the will before the first free act of the will. Or else we must come at last to an act of the will determining the consequent acts, wherein the will is not self-determined, and so is not a free act in this notion of freedom. But if the first act of the train, determining and fixing the rest, be not free, none of them all can be free, as is manifest at first view, but shall be demonstrated presently. If the will, which we find governs the members of the body,